My name's Andrea Chalupa. I'm a writer and a filmmaker.
I'm Sarah Kendzior. I'm a writer and the author of the book The View from Flyover Country.
This is Gaslit Nation with Dame Magazine. Here we are. Why are we going to have a conversation looking back on 2016 and Russia and Trump and how we got here? What's the point now?
Well, I think, we're among many who are doing that because 2016 was a lie. If they say journalism is the first draft of history, then, we had propaganda as our first draft of history, and we have to unravel that propaganda both in real time and to look back now. But I think
what you mean by propaganda is the Harvard study on how mainstream media like the New York Times, namely the New York Times, amplified right-wing propaganda in 2016.
There's a lot. We can do and maybe will do an entirely different podcast on what defines propaganda. But, we have a unique situation in that we had a candidate who was a demagogue who, lied constantly, who was given an unprecedented amount of airtime, not just
a free reality show on CNN.
Yeah, we had a reality show candidate, and we had a reality show candidate who's been embedded with corruption. And when you have that, you have to strip away multiple layers of that lie. And you also have to look at how did that lie affect people? How did it change expectations of behavior? How did it challenge the very notion of truth? And so, what I want to get to here.
So 2016 was a gaslighting election.
Yes, of course. This entire event of Trump entering our orbit has been a perpetual gaslighting.
Starting with Obama's birth certificate.
Yeah,
for many years, several years.
We could go back before that, even I think with Trump, because his whole career has been kind of based on this persona and lying to people and tricking people to get what he wants. But yeah, in terms of his political rise, I would start it there. But with Trump, we've always had demagogues in American politics. We've always had corruption, especially within the Republican Party during the Bush years. And we've had this rising conservative movement in recent years, best embodied by the Tea Party. But with Trump, I feel like we had something different because everything I've mentioned has been a distinctly American phenomenon, a distinctly American flaw. But Trump is new. He's an anti-American president. He's against his own country. He's the first president about which we had to ask, to which country does your fundamental loyalty lie? And so that's a new situation. And so, Andrea, when did you first become aware that Trump was part of a greater and unprecedented threat to American democracy and sovereignty?
Well, first, I want to say I'm grateful that we're having the conversation. I've always wanted to record somewhere the conversation of the two of us going back and recording for history's sake what 2016 was like for each of us. Because I think it was an incredibly lonely, terrifying year. I lived it and still live this way to an extent, thinking my sister could be killed. For the work that she was doing in researching Manafort.
Yeah, why don't you explain who your sister is and what her job was at this time and what her expertise is?
Yeah, I'll start with my sister, but I also want to sort of get into why it's also so important to look back and have some time, sort of right now we know it's mainstream that Trump serves the interests of Putin. That's widely known. Our allies openly talk, whoever's left among our allies, we can still call them our allies, openly talk about it. Mainstream news talks about it. It's just known that Trump is actively working against America's interests and for Putin's. If you said that in 2016, anytime you were called crazy and other things and largely dismissed, or you're, or you were Hillary Clinton, just trying to become president, and you were dismissed. But I think it's so important to preserve a record of the fact that so many credible people would interview people like Paul Manafort as though he was just another political operative running a campaign and not the head of a torture lobbyist who helped commit some of the largest atrocities, human rights atrocities, in many countries in the developing world. And another thing I really appreciate about having this conversation is I just worked on a feature film, not a documentary, but a feature film with actors and a brilliant director. And the film begins in March 1933. And so a really large challenge of the screenplay was trying to ground the audience in the fact that in March 1933, the world did not necessarily see Adolf Hitler as Adolf Hitler. Hitler was not yet the Hitler that we've come to know him as. There were a lot of articles in the mainstream press at the time, give Hitler a chance.
Hitler will pivot.
Yeah, exactly. And then
Hitler's becoming more presidential every day.
That was such a presidential speech by Hitler. He read off that teleprompter beautifully. But so and then and of course Stalin was Uncle Joe and was going to save mankind. So here you had the two greatest monsters in all of world history at a time when nobody saw them coming, or nobody saw them for what they were. And so that was the major challenge of the screenplay, and trying to ground people in a place and time when they were about to be hit by two massive asteroids at the same time. And eerily, it was very much like a time like we're living through today, which is, did not see that coming when I first started working on that script. So back to the conversation of like,
when did you realize there's something more to him than just your average racist American demagogue or horribly inept Republican
racist uncle running for office? Yeah. So obviously, it comes down to March 2016.
Mm-hmm.
When Paul Manafort was announced as the campaign chairman. And anybody who followed Ukraine, like my sister and I had for, many years, that was like Darth Vader coming over. That felt like the bigger, badder sequel of Ukraine's revolution, Putin's revenge. That's like what it was like. And it was really scary because just sort of how my sister and I came into the Paul Manafort story. So in 2015, going into the 2016 election, my sister is working on ethnic outreach for the DNC. So she's, mobilizing ethnic groups to get out the vote, working with, Indian Americans, Irish Americans, Ukrainian Americans, Russian Americans, and so forth. And it was through events in DC with civic leaders and journalists visiting from Ukraine that she's hearing that Manafort is, suddenly very politically active in Kiev. And digging into Manafort, she sees that he has a long history with Donald Trump, who's running for president. And so she starts to suspect, through her research, that there's a Russia connection with the Trump campaign. And he was just a bad guy. He helped elect Viktor Yanukovych, who was very much a Trumpian candidate. So he had succeeded with this Trumpian candidate already in Ukraine. And what ended up happening to Ukraine under Viktor Yanukovych, an estimated $100 billion disappeared from the Ukrainian budget. And that money went to enriching what they called in Ukraine the family. Viktor Yanukovych, his kids, and their inner circle. Sound familiar? So we have our own the family now under Trump. This was devastating having him here for a lot of reasons for us, because we watched very closely protesters being beaten and killed, fighting for democracy, protesting on the streets of Kiev, turning the square in Maidan in central Kiev into a fiery battle zone. We know people that were there watching people gunned down by snipers, by government snipers working under the orders of Viktor Yanukovych. Immediately when Ukrainians were able to successfully overthrow Yanukovych and he fled to Russia, like a week after, very, very quick, shortly after, Putin invades Crimea. And then shortly after that, he invades eastern Ukraine. And Russia is continuing to invade Ukraine. The war is ongoing. And by the official conservative count, 10,000 people have been killed so far in Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And Crimea is suffering from human rights abuses under Russian occupation. And this is all resulting from work done by Manafort, who helped, get these forces into power that were serving Putin's interests in Ukraine. But most Americans, especially American voters, did not know back then, did not care what would Ukraine possibly have to do with the 2016 presidential election in the US, right?
Right.
In December 2013, I tweeted, Paul J. Manafort is a political consultant who advised Bush 1 and 2, Reagan, and Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych. That tweet was shared only twice. What I found was with, the violence escalating in Ukraine's revolution, protesters being beaten by riot police, I was struggling to get just a basic explainer piece on Ukraine and the revolution placed in the mainstream press. One editor said to me, we've done enough Ukraine coverage. A few weeks later, Kiev is on fire. And a few weeks after that, Russia invades. And it's the biggest news story in the world.
And it's one of those things, I mean, when you look back at it, there was some coverage. I think we should point that out. But it's also, you have a clear line.
But it was minimal. It was print.
It was minimal.
Tim Mack, but like Betsy Woodruff in the Daily Beast. And then Frank Boer, followed it in Slate with 2 deep dives on Manafort. But then you turn on, the major networks, even MSNBC, they're interviewing Paul Manafort as
like
though,
a regular Sunday guest.
Exactly
and
right.
In the same way they're interviewing people like Bannon now. This practice hasn't stopped.
And joining me now is Donald Trump's new convention manager, Paul Manafort, a one-time delegate wrangler for President Gerald Ford and campaign manager for Bob Dole, who's been brought into this campaign to stop this delegate bleeding. Mr. Manafort, welcome back to Meet the Press.
Thank you.
Look, there's been some talk about what's going on inside the campaign. Are you running this campaign now? Is that the fairest way to look at it?
Donald Trump is running this campaign, and I'm working directly for Donald Trump, but I'm working with the whole team as well. And a lot of what's being talked about is much ado about nothing. Yes, there's a transition. It's a natural transition. Trump was doing very well on a model that made sense, but now as the campaign has gotten to the end stages, a more traditional campaign has to take place, and Trump recognized that and is now reaching out, not just with me, but with others as well that you'll start seeing come in.
Now, Donald Trump has hired you because he says he needs an insider to help him who's experiencing this. But some could argue it's been a long time since you've been a Washington insider. You yourself have said that. Do you know these delegates? Do you the selection process may be the same from 96 or 76? You know these people? Because some people say no.
You would be surprised who's been calling me over the last week and where they're from.
One thing I want to highlight with Manafort is there's been a lot of lies, not only about what you just discussed in his relationship with Ukraine, with Russia, working in that capacity and basically mobbed up, but his relationship with Trump. Trump is trying to say that he, just met Manafort. Manafort is a coffee boy. Manafort is apparently the barista who came in from the cold. I don't know. But, the relationship between Donald Trump and Paul Manafort goes all the way back to the early 80s, where they were introduced by Trump's mentor, Roy Cohn, who I can't stress enough is an important figure in this controversy and where we are.
And who is Roy Cohn?
That's where I'm getting to, girl. Roy Cohn is one of the most despicable and influential and understudied people in American history. There's no definitive Roy Cohn biography because Roy Cohn was kind of an innovator in the practice of suing everybody and threatening everybody and blackmailing everyone and bribing everyone to get what he wanted. And part of that was the preservation of his reputation.
Super builder Donald Trump has said, if you need somebody to get vicious, hire Roy Cohn. And this mafia boss man did just that. Tony Salerno, recently indicted, has long been one of Roy Cohn's clients. When Benson Ford wanted to sue his uncle, auto magnate Henry Ford, he hired Roy Cohn.
I hired Roy Cohn because he is a tough son of a bitch.
Roy Cohn was Donald Trump's mentor. Before that, he started out as Joe McCarthy's advisor, where he pioneered a lot of these tactics of lying, of attacking, of, leading people to question, have you no decency, which is a question we're still asking now. Roy Cohn went on to represent mafiosos. He was a mafioso lawyer. He was also known as somebody who bragged about not paying his taxes, who lived off of the wealth of his friends, and who was a very feared and notorious figure within New York City society. And while he was known for being awful, Wayne Barrett, who died the night before Trump's inauguration, was a journalist who studied both Trump and Cohn in depth. And, he called him reptilian. He called him Satan-like. He also noted the way that Cohn was able to infiltrate and even be beloved in parts of New York society. He was able to understand the New York media, the tabloid media, and papers of repute like the New York Times. He was able to control the media. And so Trump and Cohn began their relationship. They were very, very close in the late 70s. Donald Trump is an interesting person that he basically has had no friends. He has no close friends with the exception of Roy Cohn, who he called 15 to 20 times per day. And this is a pretty unusual thing. And, Cohn took him under his wing, represented him legally, but also taught him how to engage in politics. In 1984, Roy Cohn was gay. He was a homophobic gay man. He was an anti-Semitic Jewish man. And he was, so against the Soviet Union that I kind of wonder whether he was a pro-Soviet, anti-Soviet, rhetorical actor.
Self-hating Soviet sympathizer.
Yes. I mean, in retrospect, it makes me wonder. He died in 1986.
It should be pointed out that as Roy Cohn was dying of AIDS in 1986, Trump abandoned him. Wanted nothing to do with him.
But one thing that Roy Cohn did before he died was introduce Trump to Manafort and Roger Stone, who were working together in a political consultancy with Lee Atwater. And another person who was loosely involved with them at the time was Michael Caputo. And when you look at Trump's campaign in its early formation in 2015, it's run by Caputo, who took a little break from GOP politicking to be Putin's image consultant in the early 2000s, which should have tipped us off. Roger Stone, of course, is linked to WikiLeaks. Both Caputo and Stone are now under federal investigation, along with Manafort, who is now in jail. And so you have a number of political actors surrounding Trump who are, one, linked to Russia and have been doing work with Russia basically ever since Russia became a free-for-all capitalist oligarchy, which is extremely beneficial if your work is propping up dictators and facilitating corruption, which is the kind of work that Manafort's consultancy has done, and has been involved in GOP politics. So this whole idea that Trump is new to running for president, I mean, that's a lie. He ran or almost ran 5 times, 1988, 1996, 2000 he ran, 2012 he ran, 2016 he ran, with the help of these same people. That's a myth. The idea that he's new to the GOP is a myth because he's been hanging out with them. And the idea that he just happened to meet in 2015 on one fortunate day, Paul Manafort, who lived in his building in Trump Tower since 2005, is just utter nonsense. They've known each other for a long time. They've been working together for a long time. And this presidential campaign, in many ways, is a perfect storm, but it's also the result of long-term planning on their part. And Trump, true to his mentor, Roy Cohn, managed to get articles. I mean, I assume that they're planted, or the person who wrote them is just so fabulously stupid that they should be fired, saying things like Manafort and Trump ran into each other in the elevator one day in 2015, where Manafort offered to work for Trump for free, and Trump was so dazzled by Manafort's really awesome haircut and cool clothes that he said, "Cool, you can be my campaign advisor." That is actually the story that Glenn Thrush wrote for the New York Times. That is actually how they've tried to present this a year ago, and it's the same kind of lie that they're trying to propagate now as Manafort sits behind bars and Trump tries to keep his distance.
I mean, yes. That's like, I can't even wrap my head around that. Like, just the fact that our media, as we will always say on this show, because it's such a crisis in America, our media, the newsrooms have shrunk so much, and there's this massive blending between the business side and the editorial side. It's all about page views and clickbait and advertising and all of it, that the journalists that do remain are under so much pressure to file quickly, file clickbait, get those, get stories going viral, even though real journalism takes time and public service.
But this is something interesting.
But my God,
though.
How do you overlook something so obvious in your research as like Trump and Manafort and their long-standing intimate relationship?
Right.
These guys were cut from the same cloth. They had the same values, shared interests, and that was money, that was corruption, that was personal gain,
right,
and a lack of morals.
And in this case, the desire to use the mechanisms of government to enhance personal gain and to erase debt, which is something that both parties, both Manafort and Trump, seem to have rallied up. But something interesting about the media, though, is you're absolutely right that the media has been under financial constraint for a very long time. It's been decimated by the rise of the internet. It's been restructured in a way that you have bubbles of media influence, largely conglomerated in expensive cities on the coast. But what has always puzzled me is that these stories about Trump, a story that's true, which is often a story that's sensational, sells as well as a story that's sycophantic and a lie. Like Trump is screwing a porn star, or Trump is secretly a Kremlin asset. Those are stories that would go viral. Those are stories that aren't just relevant to the public, but are actually really interesting. You know, the kind of things that the press would traditionally grab onto. Yet, as you know, we spent 2016 trying to bring attention to these Kremlin ties, which Trump himself was making more and more overt. Yet, they, on the whole, the press was really playing them down and treating everyone who talked about them, including Hillary Clinton, as a lunatic.
But it was there all along. Like, who Manafort was there all along.
But what do you think the motivation behind that is? Like, do you have insight from how they treated your sister? Or
I think it's just a simple fact. When I was, being in New York City and having worked in newsrooms, I'm surrounded. My friends are journalists. And so I was constantly telling my own friends who are journalists, please cover Trump and Manafort, Russia, and Ukraine. And some of the smartest people in the world writing today for major outlets would say to me, Andrea, American voters don't care about Ukraine. And now they do. Ukraine was very much the laboratory for a lot of the tricks that worked successfully on hacking the U.S. election in 2016. And so if you followed Ukraine closely, if you had a diverse network of sources in Ukraine, if you knew Ukraine's own history with the Kremlin, watching 2016 from March 2016 when Manafort comes over, you see where everything is going. April was significant because you had two important print pieces come out, and yet television media was not jumping on who Paul Manafort actually was. One of these pieces in the Daily Beast titled Trump Aide-Led Torture Lobby paints it very clearly for them, yet they fail to pick up on it. And I'll read from that now. Manafort was a principal at the lobbying firm Black, Manafort, Stone, and Kelly, along with another top Trump ally, Nixon alum Roger Stone, a K Street powerhouse with close ties to the Reagan and George H.W. Bush administrations, as well as top Republicans on Capitol Hill. But over the years, they made millions by representing a rogues gallery of clients far away from D.C.'s genteel corridors of power. Dictators, guerrilla groups, and despots with no regard for human rights, including one man responsible for mass amputations and another who oversaw state-sanctioned rape. June 14, 2016, the news is announced that the Russians hacked the DNC.
A pair of teams of Russian hackers has apparently broken into the servers controlled by the DNC and has stolen their collected research, their opposition research detailing the various dealings of Donald Trump. Yes, Russian government hackers penetrated the computer network of the Democratic National Committee and gained access to their entire database of opposition research, according to committee officials and security experts who responded to the breach.
I missed this story. And my sister's at the DNC. And this story barely registered for me. And I think it's because we were living with years of hacks. Like the Russians and Chinese were hacking us. There were headlines from 2014 saying the Russians hacked JP Morgan. The Russians hacked, the White House.
The State Department, the DOD, Yahoo.
Yeah.
All of which
North
should have
Korea
tipped
hacked
us
Sony.
off.
It's like everybody's getting hacked. And so it's just like a constant weather report of hacks happening. And you just sort of learn to live with it and zone it, just like block it out.
You kind of assume if it's that bad, surely the government would be doing something about it to prevent it from, taking down our entire system from within, but apparently not. Anyway, go on.
And then, and then something tragic happens, incredibly tragic and heartbreaking on June 16, 2016, which was the murder of British MP Jo Cox.
She was just 41 years old, a mother of two young children.
Listen to me, there was once a banana, and it was a cheeky kind of banana.
Her life cut short, police and emergency vehicles swarming the scene of the attack yesterday in a quiet Yorkshire town. Eyewitnesses described the horror which happened in broad daylight.
I saw him pulling the gun out, and then he went like that, with it, and fired one shot.
Jo Cox was shot and stabbed, rushed to a hospital where she died shortly after. Minutes after the attack, police take down a suspect, a 52-year-old man identified as Thomas Mayer, who reportedly has a history of links to neo-Nazi groups.
The words I heard him say was Britain first, or put Britain first.
Jo Cox was a rising star in politics.
We are far more united and have far more in common than that which divides us.
Her senseless murder plunging Britain into grief.
For this to happen is just
And her husband, Brendan, tweeting this photo of her and issuing a statement. She would have wanted two things above all else to happen now. One, that our precious children are bathed in love. And two, that we all unite to fight against the hate that killed her.
Because Jo Cox was a beautiful, outspoken, brilliant, smart woman with opinions, she was murdered for it. And that's something that we should never forget. And that was terrifying. The fact that the fake news, nuclear bombs being thrown by Rupert Murdoch, his Fox News in the U.S. and whatever else he owns. It's like The Sun. It's all these other papers in the UK that were pushing Brexit, pushing Trump. Fake news kills, propaganda kills. So Jo Cox was like, that should have really given the world pause of, we need to declare war now on propaganda, put an end to this, and invest more in real journalism. But we didn't, and so that was an incredibly heartbreaking moment that we need to still keep in everyone's memories. Then June 23rd, you have the Brexit vote. I went to bed early that night to a sad Nigel Farage on television, and I woke up that morning, checked Facebook on my phone, and a journalist in Kiev posted a cartoon of a happy dancing Putin, and that's how I learned that Brexit had passed.
What words could be sufficient to carry the historical weight of events which unfolded on June the 24th? A divorce from the European Union was never meant to be in the script, or the implosion of the Tory party. The United Kingdom has left Europe and is without an effective leader, with no clear vision of how Brexit will work and what the impact on the people will be. Across the political divide, there is a deepening civil war in the opposition Labour Party, where leader Jeremy Corbyn is under siege and blamed for running a lacklustre campaign to remain in the EU. He has refused to go despite a vote of no confidence. In a time of crisis, effective leadership is vital. The script remains open while the UK is in a political vacuum.
So I happened to be in London the week before and the week after the Brexit vote. And I can't tell you how incredibly fascinating that was. It was like, my heart goes out to people that were, for Remain and like wanting to stay in the EU. And I know people whose lives have been upended by that. And, as an outsider, being glued to my television in my hotel room, like not wanting to leave in the morning for all the meetings I had. What followed was the world's worst House of Cards episode. You had Michael Gove stabbing Boris Johnson in the front. David Cameron resigned on national television, then walked away singing to himself. You had people being interviewed on TV who were absolutely shell-shocked after having voted for Brexit and not realizing, what have I done? Regretting their votes, but it was too late.
House of Cards.
Yes, I saw the British version. I haven't seen the American version.
You are our Frank Underwood, a lot of people are saying this morning.
Well, as I mentioned earlier...
If you turn to that camera and say something sinister, it'll be perfect. That is the problem you face now, isn't it, Michael Gove? You brought down David Cameron, then you brought down Boris Johnson. Some people are saying that you are a kind of political serial killer.
I didn't make the decision to call the referendum. That was David Cameron's decision. He chose the timing and he chose the basis.
Prime Minister David Cameron outside number 10 Downing Street, choking back emotion with the surprise announcement he would resign in the coming month.
This result to leave is monumentous, a political earthquake with the financial ramifications uncertain. The pound falling sharply, plummeting against the dollar, which of course will impact Wall Street and global markets when they open.
Nigel Farage, I remember, characterized the Brexit vote as bloodless, as a vote that, brought no violence 1 week after Jo Cox was killed. And so again, this is the exact same pattern that's replicated in the United States with Trump, where you see people
denying reality.
Yeah, denying violence in reality, both, creating narratives to stoke violence. That violence occurs and then they deny that it happens. And that's a very frightening thing to happen in a digital media age where, perception of reality can be so easily manipulated. And as you said, it's important to never forget that people who are victims of this, who are often women, who are people like Jo Cox or Heather Heyer, politically active women who end up in the line of fire in these situations.
There was a wave of hate crimes because, the racists had been empowered by this vote and they came out to harass Polish immigrants and other immigrants. Nicola Sturgeon, the first minister of Scotland, emerged as the only adult in the room, determined to keep Scotland in the EU. She was very strong, very forceful in her remarks. And then you had Trump calling himself Mr. Brexit. And what's interesting is that we saw this entire bot operation like we saw with his own election. And then Nigel Farage, of course, came out to the US to campaign for him.
2016 was extra surreal for me because I was focused on 2 film projects, a documentary and a feature film, both on the history of the Kremlin's information war, how the Kremlin deliberately covered up, with the help of Western press, useful idiots in the Western media, deliberately covered up Stalin's genocide famine in Ukraine. So I'm totally glued to these 2 film projects, which added a very surreal layer to all of this for me. Because here you had a Republican presidential candidate who himself was was walking, talking Kremlin propaganda, especially for his years of praise of Putin. So what was very odd was, on one of these film projects, I was working on a scene that was about Hitler, and the RNC there in Cleveland was on TV in the background, and I look up and it's just this like fascist pageantry. And then, at the RNC, there's these viral videos of Trump supporters salute, doing the Nazi salute, including one elderly woman who defiantly did the Nazi salute for the cameras. So throughout this year, throughout 2016, as I'm working on these film projects, the film projects themselves are throwing me back in time to the 1930s, and so is the Republican National Convention.
I am your voice.
Trump cast himself as an angry and all-powerful national defender.
I alone can fix it. I will restore law and order to our country. I'm going to make our country rich again.
Trump outlining his firm approach to fighting crime and terror.
The crime and violence that today afflicts our nation will soon, and I mean very soon, come to an end.
And offering new specifics on his proposed Muslim ban.
We must immediately suspend immigration from any nation that has been compromised by terrorism.
The GOP nominee hammering home nationalist themes, presenting the country as a dark place. The billionaire striking a populist tone too.
I have joined the political arena so that the powerful can no longer beat up on people who cannot defend themselves.
Clocking in at an hour and 15 minutes, the longest speech in modern political convention history, Trump's frequent target, his Democratic opponent.
This is the legacy of Hillary Clinton. Death, destruction, terrorism, and weakness.
In mid-July, as the Republican convention gets underway in Cleveland, we learn that the Trump campaign has watered down the GOP's platform on Ukraine, working behind the scenes to make sure that it doesn't include giving Ukraine weapons to fight Russia's invasion. Now, Russia has the second most powerful military in the world. Ukraine's military, like most everything else in the government, has been decimated by years of corruption and severely weakened, especially under Yanukovych, Manafort's client, who gets overthrown in a popular uprising and flees to Russia. So as Russia's invading, Ukraine's military leaders are forced to use cell phones, their calls easily intercepted by the Russian military, giving their positions and movements away. One military analyst in Berlin told me that Ukraine is a testing ground for Russia's advanced weaponry. Ukrainian soldiers are going up against weapons that no American soldier has had to fight against. Providing defensive aid to Ukraine is something Republicans and Democrats in Congress overwhelmingly agree with. There's rare bipartisan consensus here. Only Obama, as president, was against it, as his priority was fighting ISIS. And Secretary of State John Kerry kept trying to work with Russia and trying to find a resolution on Syria. What's more, Ukraine and the bipartisan support in Washington keeps arguing that Ukraine must be armed because the country gave up its nuclear weapons, the third largest arsenal in the world, in exchange for security guarantees. And this was all according to the 1994 Budapest Memorandum signed by the U.S. So providing defensive aid to Ukraine united Republican and Democratic leaders. And the Trump campaign is like, no, we're not doing that. This is very much what Russia wants. Then I went home to DC to see my family in the middle of July, and my sister was telling us about this strange things that were happening to her. There was like an attempted break-in on her house in the middle of the night. There was a weird song that started appearing on her phone, and it was a song called Regret. And she Googled the lyrics, and it's a death metal song by this band called Avatar. The song is about a mother owl that has just been killed and is filled with regret and anxiety as she lays dying.
We all thought my sister was losing her mind. And then my sister, so I didn't really think much of that either. And I was being very polite and patient with her when she was explaining these strange things that were happening to her. And I was like, oh, that's nice, Allie. And then she starts talking about Manafort and really, I'm like, oh, interesting, okay. But that was it. So I even dismissed my own sister at first. And then my sister kept calling me and saying, the Russians are going to do something really big before the Democratic Convention in Philly. And I'm like, what do you mean? She's like, they're gonna set off a bomb. I'm like, a bomb? She's like, I don't know. They're going to do something big to disrupt the Democratic Convention in Philly. And then Wikileaks happened.
An email scandal as emails that were hacked from the Democratic National Committee were leaked on WikiLeaks. That sent a lot of Bernie Sanders supporters into the streets here in Philadelphia over the weekend. We saw significant protests here in Philadelphia from those Bernie Sanders supporters who felt that the Democratic Party was rigged against them all through the primary process. And now we see a Democratic Party going into its convention with the resignation of the Democratic National Committee Chairman Debbie Wasserman Schultz on Sunday night. This party is in just as much disarray, guys, as the Republican Party was last week. And we're heading into a convention where they're trying to bring this party together and pivot toward the general election. We're going to have to wait and see what Bernie Sanders does during the convention this week, whether we see that kind of Ted Cruz moment that we saw last week with the Republicans. But boy, what a different storyline than we thought we were going to have here in Philadelphia, guys.
And then, the convention's happening in Philly, and so she's freaked out at this point because what she had predicted came to pass. And at this point, enough dots are connected that she's recognizing that because she went to Manafort's hometown to investigate him, on her own accord, took that on her own initiative, because she started really becoming obsessed with Manafort and what he's doing there, running Trump's campaign. What is Putin's Darth Vader doing there? She's at this point come to peace with the fact that the strange things that have been happening to her on her phone, on her computer, at her home, that's harassment. Somebody's trying to silence her. And at that point, because what she predicted came to pass with this big bomb the Russians set off with WikiLeaks, I believed her finally. And she was really freaked out. And she was like, please come to Philly, come be with me. And so I dropped everything and I went to Philly and I ended up going to the DNC convention. And the day we were driving in, to the very last day of the convention, to see Hillary accept the nomination, as we're driving in, I'm holding my sister's cell phone because she's overwhelmed. She's getting calls from reporters. I'm seeing reporters that I know, some that I don't necessarily like, pop up in her text messages and her emails trying to talk to her. Suddenly I'm my sister's gatekeeper, which is great. And I see, as I'm holding her phone, I see this song, Regret, pop up on its own. So I witnessed this. What I was laughing at her about, I witnessed it for myself. And it was the creepiest thing to just see this. Her phone was like a normal iPhone home screen. No, I'm just holding it, manning her calls for her. And suddenly this song pops up. And she's like, yep, there it is, I told you. And then we start talking about, well, where can this all go? Where could this possibly go? My sister was saying, they could hack the election results. That's a possibility. Mm-hmm. And that day, I wrote in that moment, I wrote on Facebook, I said, any journalist that doesn't investigate the possibility of the Russians hacking the election results doesn't understand the purpose of journalism. And I wrote that day and got 2 likes. No one's paying attention.
And at this point, I didn't know you, but that's literally what I was doing. After this time after the convention, as I mentioned before, we had Trump's final press conference where he explicitly showed his connection to Russia, his trust of Russia. And, he was directly asking Russia to intervene in the presidential election, which, to me was essentially an admission of some form of guilt. So I started looking into this more in depth than I had before, and I can read Russian. I learned to read Russian in graduate school because my focus was on former Soviet Central Asia. So I decided to just do a cursory search of Russian state media and kind of see what kind of narratives were coming up in there. It took me about, 20 minutes, 30 minutes to go back through a number of Russian state media outlets, including RT, to discover that they had been gushing about Trump since 2014, when he was not considered a viable 2016 candidate. He hadn't even declared candidacy yet. He was still hosting Celebrity Apprentice, but they were writing about him as not just, a future leader of the United States, but of someone who was going to save Russia, was going to save civilization. And so I followed some of the links from these Russian language articles back and found a Fox News interview from February of 2014, which was incredibly incriminating on a number of grounds.
You don't want to work? Say they're Democrats? Fine, you don't have to work. We're going to have a system that supports you to not even work anymore. Republicans have to have an uphill slog on this too, right?
Well, Clayton, it is tough for the Republicans, I think, because a lot of people are in this category. You're talking about a big category, and if anybody comes out against it, or if anybody goes against the new Democratic line of stuff, they're going to be, it's going to be hard in certain areas. Now, you know what solves it? When the economy crashes, when the country goes to total hell, and everything is a disaster, then you'll have you'll have riots to go back to where we used to be when we were great.
I think we should give the Russians a little bit of leeway here. They spent all of this money, and I think we should not be knocking them at this point. Then we wonder why they don't like us and why they're eating our lunch in every country that we're dealing with against them. I really think we should say, hey, look, they're really out there doing a job. I mean, every time I turn on television, we're showing about a guy knocking down a door because his door lock didn't work. We're showing all of these things. And I will tell you something. If I'm Putin, I'm not happy about it. And I know for a fact he's not happy about it. When I went to Russia with the Miss Universe pageant, he contacted me and was so nice. And, the Russian people were so fantastic to us. I just say this. They're outsmarting us at many turns, as we all understand. I mean, their leaders are, whether you call them smarter or more cunning or whatever, but they're outsmarting us. If you look at Syria and other places, they're outsmarting us. I really think we should not be knocking that country with with all of the money and all of the guts they put into it.
And I saw this. I was just startled. I was like, he laid it all out. And this was about a week before Russia invaded Ukraine. And I was like, Trump was on Fox News as the host of Celebrity Apprentice, discussing Russian politics, bragging about his relationship with Putin, describing his desire to tear apart America, and basically confessing everything. And why is this not everywhere? Like, why is this not in the media? So I put it on Twitter, and it went viral. I wrote about it in Quartz, where I was writing at the time. And I wrote a whole article, also noting that other Russian scholars in 2015, people who, are foreign policy analysts, had looked at Russian media and had noticed that they were gushing about Trump and thought, well, that's very strange. They didn't know the reason for it. I think now we know. And I got the most incredible blowback from the U.S. mainstream media of people telling me, leave this alone, or this doesn't prove anything, or Trump was just rambling. And I'm like, what kind of person, a game show host goes on and rambles about Putin and Russia in this way 2 years ago? This isn't an answer to a question being posed now. And so I was being gaslit.
We'll be back in 2 weeks with a deep dive on the rest of 2016, which is sadly as relevant today as it was 2 years ago. Gaslit Nation is a production of Dame Magazine, produced and distributed by Critical Frequency. Our hosts are Sarah Kendzior and Andrea Chalupa. Our producer is Amy Westervelt. Original music is by David Whitehead. Our cover art was drawn by Lucas Lisakowski. You can find Gaslit Nation wherever you get your podcasts, and please remember to rate and review the podcast. It really helps us find new listeners. Thanks for listening. See you next time.